Harold's fairy tale. One evening, Harold got out of bed, took his purple crayon and the moon along, and went for a walk in an enchanted garden. Nothing grew in it. If he hadn't known it was an enchanted garden, Harold scarcely would have called it a garden at all. To find out what the trouble was, Harold decided to ask the king. Kings live in large castles. Harold had to make sure the castle was big enough to be the king's. He didn't want to waste time talking to a prince or earl or duke. This was a king's castle, all right. It had tall towers and a big draw gate to keep out people the king didn't want to see. But when the draw gate was drawn closed, it kept Harold out too. Harold shouted for the king to come down and let him in, but the gate didn't open. He walked along the edge of the enchanted garden beside the smooth wall of the castle until he thought of his purple crayon. A person smaller than a very small mouse would be able to get in. Without even bending, he walked into a very small mouse hole. He walked through the mouse hole and into the castle. He invited the mouse in too, but the mouse preferred to stay outside. As he gazed around inside the big castle, Harold felt very tiny. And the king might not pay much attention to anyone who was smaller than a mouse. So Harold used his purple crayon again. He made sure he was as tall as 4.5 steps of stairs, his usual height. Then, that's clever, he climbed up the stairs, looking for the king. He went up and up and up, until he got so tired he couldn't climb another step. Luckily, there were no more steps. He'd reached the top. He still couldn't find the king. But he remembered kings sat on thrones. The king's throne looked very comfortable. Harold thought the king wouldn't mind if he rested a minute. He sat on the throne, wondering what it was like to be a king and wear a crown. What's he going to draw next?
Crown.
He tried it with the king's crown. It was all right for a while, but the crown began to feel heavy. So, Harold put the crown on the king's head. As he thanked the king for the loan of the crown, he noticed the king looked sad. No doubt because of the enchanted garden. He asked the king if the trouble was due to a witch or a giant. The king couldn't say which. He looked sad and helpless. Evidently, the giant, or the witch, if the king couldn't tell which it was invisible. But Harold told the king not to worry. He set off to find the invisible witch or giant, brandishing his purple crayon, and accidentally he made a hole in the wall. The accident embarrassed Harold. But the hole was a handy way out of the castle, and he climbed through it. When he looked out the other side of the hole, he realised he'd forgotten how high up he was. He needed something tall to climb down on. What's he going to draw? Something as tall as a steeple?
Leather? Slide, of course.
And to fill the hole in the castle, Harold put a handsome and useful clock. He was surprised to see how late it was. He slid down the steeple, looking for the invisible witch or giant right away. But it wasn't a steeple. It was a pointed hat. It was a giant witch. Has anyone drawn a witch? The purple crayon made it plain. It was the invisible giant witch. Well, no wonder nothing grew in the enchanted garden. How could anything grow, Harold said to himself, with a giant witch trampling round with big feet? Jessica's got big feet on her witch.
Wow.
Now that he saw what the trouble was, all Harold had to do was drive the witch out of the enchanted garden. Mosquitoes. Harold knew would drive anybody out of the garden.
Drive him out of the garden too.
He's got the pen, he can draw. But the mosquitoes drove out the witch. They were also driving Harold out too. He had to make some smoke to get rid of the mosquitoes.
His head's disappeared.
His head's disappeared in the smoke. And he'd heard once somebody say that where there's smoke, there must be fire. To put out the fire, he first thought of fire engines. But then he decided to make it rain. Rain was easier to draw. The rain soaked everything, Harold too. But he said, it's good for the flowers. And he was right. Soon, there were flowers. Beautiful flowers popped up all over the enchanted garden, more than Harold would have been able to count, all in gorgeous bloom. Harold thought how delighted and happy the king would be when he looked out from the castle in the morning. And then, amazingly, the last flower turned out to be not a flower, but a lovely fairy. She held out her magic wand, as fairies always do when they're giving somebody wishes that will come true. What wish is she going to give?
I don't know. Make the king happy. Yeah.
Harold couldn't think of a thing to wish for. But to be polite, he took one wish and told the fairy he'd use it later. Besides, Harold thought, as he started on his long walk home, a wish might come in handy sometime. We'll leave it there, and we'll find out what he does with his one wish later on.